Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Andrew Hill. Dr. Hill, are you ready to go?
I am. Thanks so much for having me, Guy. Nice to be here.
You're welcome. So Dr. Hill is the founder of Peak Brain Institute and a leading neurofeedback practitioner and biohacking coach for clients worldwide. He's lectured on psychology, neuroscience, and gerontology at UCLA's Department of Psychology, where he received a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. At Peak Brain, Dr. Hill provides individualized training programs to help you optimize your brain across goals of stress, sleep, attention, brain fog, creativity, and athletic performance. He's the host of the Head First podcast and continues to do research on attention and cognitive performance. Dr. Hill, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Great introduction. And we also, of course, do a lot of work with trauma because that's a thing you can see in the brain. And just to jump right into the deep end of the topic, one thing I was thinking about as, what can I offer to a trauma-informed audience, so to speak? When we look at a brain map or a measurement of someone's brain at rest, if the trauma you've experienced is somewhat acute and somewhat recent, the brain sort of cramps up in response to it. And you sort of see the resources overactivated, kind of similar to how someone's lower back might spasm up in a car accident so you can walk away. But 10 years later, there's this resistance, this stiffness of the tissues having been sort of pushed to their edge, and they're now regulated a little differently. Most anxiety phenomena, including the complex stuff involved with trauma, is actually not a disease process. It's sort of an accommodation of a naturally occurring, useful daily resource that's spasmed up super hard. So if you have classic sort of trauma response stuff like PTSD, end of the pool, you'll see the posterior cingulate, the back midline of the brain, as being somewhat activated. This is, of course, the lifeguard who wants to go watch the road, heads up, when you're doing that appropriate thing and evaluating the environment. But when you learn the world is not especially safe or predictable, this can cramp up, and you can sort of see that the brain develops this over-evaluation mode where it's now essentially ruminating. So trauma and suffering and all kinds of things that we deal with our minds, the risk, I think, the extra burden we carry is that a lot of it feels invisible and blind to us. It's happening to us, but we don't really know why. And I love to show people their brains and show them the real stuff that can be suffering. But when you see it on data, when you see it painted out in pictures and colors, you start to develop a different relationship with it. Now you can think of your trauma response, your anxiety, your OCD, your sensory irritability, whatever, kind of like your shoulder that separated during that soccer game. You can be annoyed at it. It's frustrating. It really hurts. Probably should deal with it. But suddenly it's really hard to feel overwhelmed quite as much or guilty or ashamed or even disempowered as much if you understand how it works. So that's sort of our role at Peak Brain for easy and complex stuff, to sort of go, hey, it's just your brain. Would you like to figure out a little bit of that neuroscience and see how it works?
That's a great intro. I want to dive more into that. But I first want to find out, you skipped right over this very important question. And that is, where are you from originally and where are you currently?
I am from originally the Northeast. I was born in Maine and grew up mostly in Massachusetts. You can't tell because when I moved down from Maine to Massachusetts, my mother was like, to all the kids, like, oh, you don't drop your R's. You sound so tough. Don't do it. So we all learned to speak like newscasters a little bit. And we, not have like clipped diction of New England. But then I moved to years ago, and I moved to the West Coast to Southern California for grad school. And I live in Los Angeles now. And after grad school, I taught for a few years at UCLA, and I opened up some startups and did some things around addiction. and have a company that's still running called True Brain that I helped found in 2012 right after grad school, which does nootropics, which are cognitive enhancing compounds.
I think I've heard of that.
And I also opened Peak Brain as our sort of the final form, if you will, of this thing I'm trying to do, this empowered evangelist coaching, take control of your brain, thrust agency upon you kind of role. It's something that's not really a therapist where there's a container and transference, and nor is it purely mechanical like a coach in the gym. It's somewhere in between. We're using tools of access and insight and agency and perspective and self and transformation, but it's somewhat mechanical and iterative, and the person with you is there to help shepherd, not, necessarily treat in that way that a therapist might. So I'm in Los Angeles, as a long-winded answer now. Yeah.
How did you get into this field, into this interest?
I had a lot of experience working in pretty much every aspect of mental health that you can imagine before grad school. Many years working as a manager of residential environments for people with multiple disabilities, developmental issues that were quite severe, no language, motoric issues, cerebral palsy, people that were visually and auditorily impaired. So I spent, years sometimes teaching someone to use a fork or learning their particular version of tactile sign pigeon so I could communicate with their 30 words that they happen to, hold on to. Really, really acute edge case in some ways, human suffering. And then I worked in acute psychiatric environments because that was better than working in the acute developmental in some ways for seeing progress and seeing change. Still wasn't great. And I saw a lot of really acute suffering that just wasn't progressed. It was somewhat managed. It was palliative. But I saw a lot of
that field, Andrew.
To working with people.
In that context, in those contexts.
Well, I'm good at it, basically. I'm good at understanding people. I'm good at working with someone and putting myself in their shoes and communicating with them. That can be somebody who's got kind of iffy language or a sensory issue or a kid who's got wild ADHD. Or it can be somebody who's suffering with subtle, complex brain stuff at this point. I mean, sort of one of my gifts is teaching people about stuff in whatever way they need to know it, whatever way, whatever language, whatever perspective, whatever metaphor. And when I was doing that in acute psychiatric environments, it calmed people down. And I found that I could sort of be, a force for soothing and low toning, regulating really pretty violent environments where people are getting very dysregulated in like locked ward facility, acute psychiatric. And when I was working with people that were really acute nonverbal, deaf, blind, I found that seeing how they used language was and interacting with them, even in a limited language, 30, 40, 50 words, tops, total. There's still a way to connect with every individual at that level, no matter how impaired that piece of it is. And even folks that didn't have language. When I ended up working in neurofeedback, my first job in neurofeedback, to bring this around to your question, how I got into it was I was working in psychiatric acute work and I got injured. I was doing restraints. I was in charge of, I was doing many things at a psychiatric hospital on the East Coast. And one of them was teaching all of the other technicians how to do safe restraints when there was, violence happening and self-harm happening. And this was a time when the insurance system was ceasing to pay on mental health. And the average bed stay, so to speak, in these inpatient hospitals I was working at when I started there was 11, 12 days of approval. And after a couple of years, it was down to 2 days of approval. And you don't even get psych meds working in 2 days usually for a lot of things. So staff was dwindling and acuity was going up and the revolving door was revolving faster. And I got injured and I blew my back out pretty aggressively. And for the next couple of years, left human services completely after 10 years doing different human services work, and went into high tech, sales engineering and databases and all kinds of cool tech stuff. And then around, this is year 2000 now, the tech bubble corrected, or just after. And I decided I miss working with people. So I went and found an autism center, which had some of the developmental skill set that I was good at. And did neurofeedback and brain mapping, EEG, which I was super interested in, but hadn't done any experience in, but I had the geekery deep and I could, handle any tech that I needed to. So I ended up working in this place in Providence, which over a couple of years taught me to do neurofeedback. And I started seeing all this amazing change with executive function and sensory and social things that I had good experience for more than a decade of thinking that could not change. We couldn't change this point of suffering or that phenomena. And then I was seeing change happen more often than not in a neuroatypical developmental population. And it just blew my mind.
Wow.
And at the time, early 2000s, the field of neurofeedback was not that young. It was discovered in this form sort of in the late 60s, but it was still somewhat nascent, still is somewhat nascent in terms of a wild west of techniques and providers and ideas about how it works. And back then there was about 3 different schools of thought that all had pretty vitriolic arguments within the field about how it worked. And they all disagreed. And they all created completely different approaches about how to do things to the brain because of that disagreement, and all, yelled at each other, climbing crabs out of the bucket. And the weird thing is no matter that they had this irreconcilable, conflicting underpinning of ideas, it all worked really well. They all got better effects than traditional psychotherapy or medication for the things they work for. They all worked. So I call this a blind men and elephant situation, where we all have a piece of it and we're kind of describing something and, claiming we have the truth, and we don't. And there was a perspective that was missing. So after doing this for a couple of years, I ended up, doing the work as a neurofeedback technician for a couple of years. I ended up going back to grad school and studying how neurofeedback works and looking at the loop of information as the neurofeedback is presented to the brain, how the brain reacts to it, and how we can bind that learning signal and, doing cool, sophisticated stuff to actually figure out, what all these different giants that I learned from in the field, like, what was going on there. Can I contribute something? Can I solve some of these problems? Can I advance the practical field of neurofeedback? So that was my PhD.
Very well put.
Thank you.
And I loved earlier when you were describing neurofeedback, and you were kind of making an analogy to, a shoulder that's thrown out when something goes on in our head or in our brain. It's like, there's maybe for many of us, there's like, what is going on? So what do you do specifically? Walk us through an example. Someone comes in, let's use, if you can, trauma on the continuum there as an example.
Sure. So, we all have brains. We're all weird. No one's average. The goal is never to say, wait a minute, why aren't you average? So a lot of human analysis, a lot of assessment of individuals is really focused on typicality, difference from average in terms of what really sticks out. And that's really true of brain stuff because the brain matures. And so you have to do sort of age matched comparisons. This is true of like IQ tests. This is true of strength tests, true of height. A lot of it's age matched developmental, and that's imprecise and it's not perfect, but you still get a sense of variability within an age of natural, a bell curve of variability. So we would do something called brain mapping as an assessment, where we do 2 things as part of that. One is the world's most boring 20-minute attention test. And we have you like click on a mouse when a 1 pops up on the screen or is spoken over the speakers, and not click on a mouse when a 2 pops up. But the computer's going 1, 1, 2, again and again for about 20 minutes. And shifting back and forth between auditory and visual. So of course you start missing the 1s and drifting, and you start error correct, clicking on the 2s. And we can tease apart things at a much more granular level than like just ADHD. We can tease apart impulsivity aspects or fatigue or auditory versus visual or stamina, reaction time quirks, repetitive monitoring errors, and really decompose the executive function into these things that kind of lump together at the DSM level, at the diagnostic level, into things we call ADHD now. But you can have those phenomena from COVID or from a concussion or from trauma disrupting your sleep. So we first measure the executive function because it's one of these foundational things in the brain that flexes under any stress at all, and really describes other resources, because the executive function resources, about half of them are shared with the things that stage sleep appropriately. So you tend to get this sleep and executive function overlap. There's a frequency in the brain called sensory motor rhythm that neurologists call sleep spindles, or sigma. And it's used for motoric inhibition, for sitting still, basically, and for pumping the brakes and not going squirrel. So if you see a cat in a windowsill watching birds, that's still body and laser-like focus, balance, poised, ready. That's a high SMR state, high sensory motor rhythm tone state. And that calm cat watching birds is literally the opposite of ADHD. You can't have motoric stillness and you're pulled by information that's variable. So we first do intention test because it matters for everyone, basically. And then we do what's called a brain map, or a QEEG, where you put a cap on the head and you squirt it full of gel and some ear clips and measure the brain at rest for about 20 minutes, 10 of that eyes closed and also eyes open. Mm-hmm. Now, those three things, the performance and the two physiology measurements, are compared to a database of people your age. And then we sit down over Zoom or something usually, and I tell you how weird you are. And some of the performance matters. Oh, there's some inattentiveness, an auditory processing issue. Well, your reaction times are kind of a little iffy. You tired? It can matter. It's interesting. The brain maps, though, I don't know what's true for you. I just know it's weird for you. People are weird. Great. Good job. This might all be just awesome or fine or performant or amazing. But hey, let's talk about some of this stuff that's outliers, that's unusual for your age group, for as brains in general. Some of it tends to matter. And I keep my guesses to the stuff that's plausible, not every little bit of data that's showing up, because data is noisy. Human data is very variable. So we look for big things that are sticking out. And I sit down with you and might go over a handful of pages of data that have little heat maps showing bright colors where things are unusual. So we might see, in this example, some blobs of red in the front and back midline. And the red would be like large amounts of everything. Basically, everything's color shaded. So blue amounts on a heat map are cold or low amounts of brain waves, and red is a large amount of brain waves. And again, by themselves, not that interesting. But if you looked at a brain and saw a lot of beta waves, a strong red activation in the front midline and the back midline, you would know someone's cingulate, anterior cingulate or posterior cingulate, was more active than usual with beta waves. True statement. You got a lot of beta waves. Power, strong. And the cingulates are involved with switching your focus around. Naturally, they do lots of stuff. And generally, the front of the brain is the inside self, and the back of the brain is the outside world in terms of how we process information. So the cingulates help hold the internal attention on what you're thinking about in the front, and do the watch the road, heads up, frisbee kind of thing in the back. Help you orient and evaluate and reorient to the outside world. Well, when these guys cramp up, then the one in the front, we start to perseverate, obsess, get stuck in our head, play songs. The one in the back, we tend to ruminate, get visceral, become threat sensitive, ruminate. And, both of those things can happen. And then you're sort of playing ping pong with stuff in your head that bothers you. Did you hear? I heard. Did you worry? I'm worrying now. Did you hear? I heard, and then this resonance of visceral worry and cognitive worry starts to ramp up.
All right, let's just pause here for a second to thank our sponsors. All right, we are back.
So when I look at someone's brain maps, I don't know if they have a PTSD phenomenon from the posterior cingulate, but it's plausible. Maybe they're just a lifeguard and it works for them. I don't know if the one in the front is like OCD features. Maybe they're a CEO and it works for them, but maybe their thoughts are having them and it's a bit cramped up and it's a bit intrusive. So I would walk through these features and say, hey, your posterior cingulate's kind of hot. That often means we're feeling a little activated and threat sensitive, evaluating the world constantly. Are you ruminating a little bit? Does that sound real? Oh, it does. So sorry you're experiencing that. I'm glad we're seeing it. Because the next step of neurofeedback, of brain mapping and this neurofeedback stuff we do is, if we see stuff in a brain map, you can change it. It's hard to understand our brain, but it's actually not that hard to change regulatory features: stress, sleep, attention, speed. Those are things that are supposed to attune and adjust and regulate for you. And they actually respond really well to being pushed on and stretched. This is sort of why they cramp up as well. The posterior cingulate isn't necessarily a disease process when it cramps up into trauma. It's an acute accommodation, because guess what? The cost of missing danger, high. You miss it twice, game over. So there's this negativity bias where the brain's like, oh my God, tigers. I've learned tigers exist. I'm going to think about tigers all the time. Dude, I'm reading a book. Is it a tiger book? No, I'm taking a bath. Are there water tigers? Brain, what are you doing? And that's the posterior cingulate deciding, hey, have you thought there might be some danger you need to evaluate and orient to? Have you thought? Maybe. And that can be a surface level, a recent, a trauma, classic PTSD phenomena. Earlier stuff, earlier life, long-term movement, CPTSD, developmental trauma, isn't really about the posterior cingulate because you've learned and developed in a world that was more aversive, that had less secure attachment. And so you don't see the cingulate cramped up against the environment being unmonitorable or needing more monitoring than you're doing. Instead, you get deeper tissues that actually don't have EEG, don't have actually brain waves. And things like the periaqueductal gray, which is the part of the brain that dumps like natural morphines into your system when you hit your thumb with a hammer. That moment of pain relief after you slam your thumb is natural endorphins and enkephalons. Turns out we've discovered recently that periaqueductal gray also codes strong experiences of emotional pain. So it's not doing the threat sensitivity. Where's the tiger? It's doing the thing. Hey, did you remember that years ago there was a tiger you missed? Yeah, you really should think about that just in general. Yeah, hey, don't forget there's tigers every so often. So it's a pre-alert, not the actual visceral alert, but it's a bias towards that. And it's very, very involved with trauma stuff. It tends to also have coupling with the amygdala, which doesn't have EEG either, or brainwaves either. But for folks who are wondering why I'm saying brain tissue doesn't have brainwaves, EEG or brainwaves is only a feature of the bark, the cortex of the brain, that has something called pyramidal cells, neurons that sit in these giant columns that burst together in electrical firing and create information encoding. A lot of the brain, subcortical, doesn't have those cells that burst in rhythmic waves. So the cortex is connected to those tissues like the amygdala, but the amygdala itself doesn't burst in beta waves or alpha waves or things like that. It doesn't have those signatures. So if someone wants to train attachment, which is an amygdalar thing, the amygdala helps code for the emotions you associate with memories. So if you have a trauma experience, you go into the towers during 9/11, your amygdala then is activated about those experiences. Or if you give someone beta blockers going into a trauma experience, or do therapy later on with beta blockers on board and reactivate the amygdala, you create new learning around the trauma response and pull the teeth of the emotional access. This is a newer tool that's being used sometimes, these beta blockers in acute trauma response, and also prophylactically for people, for trauma workers, for crisis workers. So
let me jump in. Wow. Okay.
There's a lot there. Sorry.
There's a lot there. Let me just pause for a second. We introduce you here. We're talking with Dr. Andrew Hill at Peak Brain Institute. So very interesting here. You know, you mentioned about the kind of position of what you're talking about here in terms of trauma therapy.
Yeah.
And it's not very well understood. How does someone who has been traumatized, maybe they have experienced complex PTSD, they come to you, how do you work with them?
No matter what you're working on, trauma, ADHD, seizure, peak performance, creativity, all I really care about is, do you have goals around your regulation and your performance? Those can be goals of suffering and reducing suffering. Those can be goals of performance. But knowing what success feels like, what regulation feels like for someone, where things are important, tells me an awful lot about how to help them generally. But I also do my review of someone's brain data cold. I walk through it blind.
Interesting. Okay.
And I say, hey, look, your brain has a few of these interesting features. Do they matter to you?
So someone could come to you, maybe they have been traumatized, but you would know that before you did their brain mapping?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I would say you can even flip it. Many of us have threat sensitivity, activation, a trauma response, some perseveration, some rumination, some social activation. And you see that in a lot of people, even those without trauma diagnoses, so to speak.
Right.
You know, we can have dysregulated threat sensitivity without a therapist giving it a name. It can be really in the way. It doesn't have to be exactly like everyone else's either. You know, it can just be about your mother-in-law because of learning, or it can be broad, or it can be only when you have low blood sugar, or only when your sleep gets iffy. And that's what I find too, is it's never one thing. It's never just about your cingulate, learning the world sucks, and now keeping your fists up. It's also about the sleep maintenance issue that's given you, and how that slows down your speed of processing. And then you can't think clearly. So you stand on the gas internally, and then you feel brittle and pushed and even more unrested later on. And then you get angry because you're so under-resourced, that you're so protective that you can't just feel anxious, and now you're angry as well. And it's a very complicated phenomena. But if I look at someone's brain, those things are all true for that person, perhaps. But what I'm seeing is their trait resources instead. So I have the freedom, I have the opportunity, the necessity to drop below the level of the diagnostic label or the thing that they've been told, right, and say, hey, here's some neuroscience about you. Here's some physiology that I think is interesting. And it looks like it might be a little unusual, good or bad, interesting. We measured some performance. This might go along with it. It gives some context. But how much of this is interesting, and would you like to change it? So I'm able to really
I'm feeling very nervous. I'm feeling very uncomfortable in the world. What do we do? How do I work on that?
So then I would do neurofeedback generally. Now, man with a hammer, every problem's a nail, per Maslow, but neurofeedback's my heavy lifter. So that's my big hammer. And it's this process of training those brain waves, those EEGs. So in the case of like classic PTSD, you might want to exercise the posterior cingulate and relax it so it learns to put its fists down more voluntarily. You can decide to stop evaluating and stop ruminating, essentially. And the way you would do that is you would look at the cingulate. Generally, there's going to be a lot of beta waves there. There might not be a lot of alpha waves. It might be hard to find the neutral wave, which is the alpha, the rest mode between the gears. And you might have a lot of theta, a lot of juiciness, a lot of disinhibition, a lot of squirrel in that tissue. So it cramps up, it spasms and stays activated, and it's hard to relax, metaphorically. And that's a function of having a lot of theta, a lot of beta, and not a lot of alpha for many people. So throw some ear clips on, stick a wire on the scalp, a little bit of paste, stick it there. Measure the beta, measure the theta, measure the alpha. So this relaxation tone, this alpha, this neutral, and that tissue is going to vary moment to moment. So are the activation and the release tones, the betas and the thetas. You measure them moment to moment. Whenever the brain happens on its own to make more alpha for half a second and less of the other two, you applaud it. Make a sound happen, make a little puzzle piece start filling in, make your Pac-Man eat some dots, make your car chase more zombies. Whatever, it doesn't really matter what the stimulus is, but the brain hears, good job, brain, good job, brain, good job, brain, nope. Good job, good job, good job, nope. Whenever it happens to make bursts of alpha. And then the big trick is every 30 seconds or so, you move the goalposts. So this ends up being something called operant conditioning, where you're shaping, you're applauding progressive, successive changes in behavior. The weird thing is the behavior is involuntary because you can't feel your brain waves. So the mind's like, really? This stupid Pac-Man on the screen stopping and starting is training my brain? Really? Okay, my friend said this works. All right, whatever. And you don't feel it the first time either. So you're like, all right, that was kind of weird. And then you do it 2 or 3 more times and you're like, oh, hey, wait a minute. Because the brain goes, oh, alpha makes stuff happen? A couple sessions in, and it reaches for a huge amount of alpha. And you feel that, and you're like, whoa. And this particular protocol, the training down the outside ranges, thetas and betas, training up the alpha at PZ, at the parietal midline, produces a sensation that feels like you're unclenching your mind. Hey, wow, that felt like, am I imagining this? No, this actually feels like, wow. Hey guys, this feels really interesting. I feel kind of calm. I'm not sure I kind of like this. Wow. And then it wears off and you're like, I must have wanted that to happen. And you try it again and it's stronger. And you're like, no, actually something happened. Great. How was your sleep? Actually, my sleep was kind of crappy after that relaxation. Aha. Okay. Do half of that. Let's add some of this. Okay. Try this now. Let's add some of the beta for sleep regulation and dial it in. How'd that feel? Wow. I was calm and I had great dreams and slept great. That was really weird. All right. Do it twice more this week. Let's build it up and see how it stabilizes. So it's mysterious, but not blind. This is the opposite of diagnosing and being right about what has happened in the past. It's all about spotting a phenomena, stretching it, creating
Wow.
subjective experience, iterating. It's much closer to personal training than it is to medicine or psychology in its actual practice. And you see why, it's all about thrusting agency back up on you instead of creating
I
this
was just going to say, there's something it feels very self-empowering. And so this is really fascinating to me. And I love the way you're articulating this, because you're doing it in a way that I haven't heard before. It's very exciting, actually. How would you describe this? So we got a lot of listeners here, obviously, who are therapists, who are survivors, a combination of the two, coaches, et cetera. How would you talk about this in terms of how it differs from other forms of therapy for psychotherapy?
Well, clearly it goes hand in glove, right? I mean, there's resources and there's habits and there's cognitive stuff and there's attachment and there's learning. So you want to get your brain out of the way, but you also then want to learn skills and learn to drop away accommodations and callous you've built up through behavioral things to protect you. And that's different than having a dysregulated spasming resource a little bit. They're related, but you can, you learn to first not be triggered by your mother-in-law, and then you learn not to yell at her later on. Those things don't necessarily happen all at once. You may be like, wow, she didn't leave me shaking mad. That was interesting. It's kind of a jerk though still, huh? All right. And you progress, you have a different relationship with your resources. So with a therapist in the mix, and most neurofeedback people that do trauma work are therapists, like they do neurofeedback and therapy together. But you can also work with a therapist. We do a lot with EMDR, with brain spotting, family systems, somatic experiencing, and they all dovetail beautifully with neurofeedback because the neurofeedback helps keep the brain moving. So it gets the brain out of the way. So the therapy lands really, really well. B, it actually jacks up plasticity to 11 for like 24 to 36 hours after every single neurofeedback session. So literally your therapy starts to get in, learning, all kinds of things start to change faster. And you can use neurofeedback both to like break through cognitive blocks. You can do alpha theta neurofeedback for hypnagogic state access. For someone's really shut down, alexithymic, numb, you can actually break free into that moment of insight and awareness as you fall asleep. That like, wow, cool idea. You can get reliable access to that state. And that can be useful for a trauma context. So controlled dissociation almost. You can also do things around the periaqueductal gray and the posterior cingulate directly. And as you work through someone's brain resources, they can do the different shifts in their life and their safety and their relationships as they need. A lot of therapists have come across Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel wrote the foreword for a book by Seaburn Fisher, which is called Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma. And while some of the techniques are a little different than when the book was published, a lot of that is good backing for folks that are wondering about this landscape. And I would say it's pretty valid, not just for developmental trauma, but in general, how Seaburn writes is quite informative on the brain processes and how we think about it and how we go after it in some ways. So for folks who are more therapists than I am and are really interested in that dovetailing and how it blends, I would say Seaburn's book is a great book.
Okay. She's also been on this podcast. You can access her interview too. Wonderful. So at Peak Brain Institute, break it down. What do you do?
Yeah. So we do neurofeedback programs and some mindfulness training, but mostly neurofeedback and brain mapping. And we have centers all around the US and now opening up in Europe. And folks can join the club, so to speak, and get free access to unlimited brain maps. And they can explore how the stuff they're doing to their brain changes them, how their medication works, how their cannabis is hitting them, how their Adderall hits them, whatever. And it's a great tool of agency first and foremost. And then many of our clients do what's called neurofeedback. And those programs are usually about 3 months long. We actually are unusual in that about 85% of our clients train their brains from home and never see our offices. We send out equipment, we do remote coaching, remote assessments, and our clients work with us live and have live support 7 days a week to do neurofeedback and progress through stuff. So even more agency. You can do it at home, take control of your stuff, even if you can't get to one of our offices. We have offices in 4 US cities and 2 in Southern California and LA and Orange County. also in St. Louis and New York City. And we're opening up in London and Stockholm right now. And we have other partners throughout the world as well. So we can often help you no matter where you are, which is kind of fun as well.
Now, do you offer workshops for therapists who are interested in learning how to do this, or?
We do not right now supervise therapists, but we're working on a platform, a wellness platform that should let us support therapists doing this work a little bit better. That question you just asked, I get asked every single week by a therapist at least once. The field of neurofeedback has been actually shrinking over the past 10 or 20 years, not growing, because the people that discovered it have been finally retiring and dying, essentially. Like it's that kind of field where it's always been taught in this like black art, apprentice teach an apprentice teach an apprentice. And the research literature always lacks, it lags by decades to what's possible clinically for a bunch of reasons. Clinicians should hear this. One, you couldn't blind neurofeedback, couldn't blind EEG until I did the first study in 2010 or something on double-blind, placebo-controlled EEG. You couldn't really do it. You couldn't blind the EEG before that. Also, it's individualized. How do you test something across groups of people that's heavily individualized? It's also expensive. No one owns neurofeedback. How do you spend $5 million on a, Class A gold standard, NIH style study? And then we've had well poisoning, aggressive well poisoning from insurance companies and big pharma and things in the 70s and 80s that really worked against the field. So it's this bizarre, often the niches kind of black art. And the number of providers is actually shrinking. There's probably only a couple thousand providers in the US total who do this with any sophistication, essentially. Although the cost of hardware and software is coming down so much that we're getting this prosumer biohacker kind of overlap as well. So what we're trying to do at Peak is, and we've built a system for this now. It's how we run our worldwide virtual business. But we sort of track as you report your sleep, your stress, your mood, your anxiety day to day. And as you report the stuff you're doing, your meditation, your neurofeedback, we're actually having overlays and seeing how the stuff we're helping you plan and try and execute on is landing. So when you tell us, ooh, my sleep was really crappy after that new protocol, one of your coaches will see your report, grab it, help adjust your workout plan for the next couple of sessions if it matters, or to respond to your new needs. Jump back in your private chat and say, hey, thanks for that sleep report. Yeah, that beta protocol might have been too fast. Let's try a slower one. I checked in with our clinical team. They think 15 hertz was too fast. So let's try 14 and a half. We'll do a short session. If this lands well, you might feel a little bit less focused, but sleep great. And so it's this very iterative process where folks get to learn what they're doing essentially as they do it. And that keeps us out of the treatment landscape and more into the training.
And just to be clear, so people listening, therapists listening, they can recommend or refer their clients to you. This can be an adjunctive.
Yeah. In all of our physical offices, we give all of our podcast listeners a discount. So the annual membership is usually $500, but it's half price for folks of your listeners of your podcast who want to come on in and mention it. And that gives you unlimited access to brain mapping. So a therapist can use that, refer a client in, and then with the client's permission, of course, we would share that video of the discussion and the high points and the neuroeducation around the client's brain with the therapist. And I can't tell you the number of therapists whose, the scales fall away when they realize they can distinguish ADHD from anxiety in a brain map.
Right.
Or ADHD from trauma because they can look the same. Or a sleep issue from ADHD because they can look the same. And that is such a tool for a therapist to know where they should be applying pressure. Is it psychoeducational because it's sleep and ADHD? Is it something we should be doing DBT on because it's a trauma response thing? It's just information. It's just data. So this is why we provide the brain mapping in our offices with this sort of open-ended, agency. And yeah, folks can send their clients in, their patients in from wherever they like in the US and other places we are, and we can send gear out remotely. So if folks are acute, we can do, we do full virtual systems, and we send them out and we work with you wherever you are. And we would be more than happy, delighted to have other people on the team to handle aspects of need and goal that we're not experts in. We have a mindfulness teacher for you. We got a neurofeedback we have 2 or 3 different neurofeedback coaches on your team to make sure there's someone there 7 days a week. And you got a couple of clinical scientists. I'm your head coach essentially with other coaches. But if we can add somebody external to that team, and then they're also on your private chat and they get CC'd on your data, and we love that because it helps someone else support your transformation. Please, yes.
Awesome. All right, Andrew, what is the best way for people to reach you and get in contact with you?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So most of our socials are on Peak Brain LA because that was our first location, and our website's peakbraininstitute.com. So come check us out, ask us your brain questions. I also have the Head First with Dr. Hill podcast, which has been lying fallow for a few years, but is starting to drip out episodes momentarily again. So come check us out there too.
We'll have all that linked up at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. Dr. Hill, awesome. Love to have you back at a later date. Appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, Guy. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.